In this lesson, we're going to take a look at defense mechanisms and why we need to know about them. We hear all the time about defense mechanisms, but what are they? Well, they're really just ways for us to cope, and they're also a response to anxiety. There are healthy and unhealthy ways of dealing with anxiety and in terms of defense mechanisms. But what you need to understand is that they can change in severity or meaning or even intensity. And what I'm here to do is to help you recognize as a nurse is that when people use these, they're really just dealing with anxiety. Let's look at the different types and see how you're going to handle them. Think of defense mechanisms as being on this spectrum. You have your unhealthy ways over here to the left, and then you've got your more healthy ways on the right. People that are more in the healthy region cope better. So I'm going to give you some examples of different types of unhealthy defense mechanisms. Now, this is not an all-encompassing list, but these are some examples. So denial is really the rejection of reality. They don't believe what's happening is happening, or they try to convince themselves that it's simply not true. An example of this would be like an amputee who refuses to look at his surgical site after his surgery. If he doesn't look at it, it doesn't exist. Regression is another one. Regression is like reverting back to childhood. So an example of this would be like bedwetting for a patient who's already potty trained or an adult. And this would be a response to like extreme stress or anxiety. Projection is another type of unhealthy defense mechanism. It's really just misattributing or projecting the cause of the anxiety to someone else. So this would be like being angry at somebody and then saying that that other person is angry. That's really what projection is. The thing that you want to realize with these unhealthy ones is that there's no effort to resolving the issue. You're simply just deflecting the truth, and the patient may not realize the importance of reality here. Moderate defense mechanisms are slightly more healthy, but it doesn't mean that they are absolutely healthy. They tend to cause less long-term effects, and they can be resolved sooner, but there's still room for progress towards this to having your patients cope a little bit better. Displacement is, we're going to look at a couple here, but displacement is the redirecting of anxiety towards other people. So if you have a patient that was given like a terminal illness and they get mad at the doctor and then they yell at their spouse, what they're doing is they realize there's a problem there, but they're still not dealing with it, and they're putting that blame on the spouse. Intellectualization is another one. So this is really focusing or overthinking about the process, and which is you're still not really looking at the issue at hand. So a patient, let's say, look at that patient with terminal illness. What they're focusing on is the testing and maybe the patho and little nuances of disease, but they're really not looking at how they should cope with what's actually happening. So it's still a little bit better than your unhealthy ones, but it's definitely going in the right direction. Now, undoing is another one in this category. This is basically saying I'm going to take back something, or be something I said, or take back behavior. So let's look at the patient who yelled at their spouse. Well, they realized that they actually did something wrong, and so what they want to do is they turn this yelling into like praise for the spouse, so that they'll talk about how great their character is, or how nice they look, or all these other good qualities. So they recognize that there's an issue here, and they're focusing on this positive thing instead of directing their anxiety and their focus on what's actually going on with themselves. Let's now look at some healthy defense mechanisms. What's interesting about your healthy defense mechanisms is that they may not even seem like they actually are defense mechanisms. There's this negativity that's associated with the term defense mechanisms. And we're going to try to get away from that here. When we talk about healthy, these people have better abilities to cope. And what we want to focus on here is that even though these are healthy ways of coping with anxiety, they still have to be resolved. And I'm going to go into a little bit more about that here in a few minutes. But let's start with some examples. So sublimation, I use this one all the time. It's basically a way for people to channel their feelings into something different. So a good one is like exercise. So if you get stressed or you get mad, you can go to the gym and let off that steam. So that's one way to channel it healthily. Another one is anticipating. So there's a difference between worry and anticipation. And what people who anticipate things, they pre-plan for something to happen. And when they do that, this is a better nuance of this type of defense mechanism versus worrying. Worrying is a negative thing. But the thing with anticipation is it's basically a pre-planning for something to maybe to be not as optimal. So like family members that have that their loved one is going to die, they anticipate that it's going to happen. And so they kind of deal with it and they make plans to package it up neatly so they can cope with that anxiety or that stress. The last one is suppression. And this is another great one to look at. And this one can also be tricky because I'm definitely a pro at this. But this is one where the person realizes that they're in a situation that they can't, it may not be appropriate, right? So let's say you have a couple at a Christmas party and they realize that they have some sort of conflict. Well, if you take that situation and say, hey, this is not appropriate, I'm going to take these feelings, bottle them up, and I'm going to hold on to them, and we're going to put them aside. And we're going to deal with this later. But the important thing about this is to make sure these feelings get processed eventually, because if they don't, that starts to go the other way, and this begins to become an unhealthy way of coping with anxiety. But understanding that this particular situation is going to actually cause a lot more conflict and it can blow up and we have to deal with all that other stress. If we say, hey, you know what? This was not cool, but we're going to deal with this a little bit later, and you get through that and then you kind of process them later, that's definitely a more healthy way to do that. And now that we've looked at the different types and where they fall in the spectrum, what we want to look at is how we deal with them as nurses. Well, your first objective is you want to recognize anxiety. You want to realize that there's a negative stimulus or a negative reaction to that stimulus. And what we want to do is realize that it's a negative thing and that it is a defense mechanism. And like we talked about, some responses are healthy and some are unhealthy and some fit kind of in between that spectrum. But when your physical assessment, take a look at their verbal and their nonverbal cues and see if you can clue into if a patient is anxious or nervous about something. Also communicate with your patient, focus on the cause of the anxiety and ask your questions, right? So some people are already in defensive mode. And what you want to do is you want to be therapeutic. So we can go back to our therapeutic communication of like paraphrasing or empathizing or active listening. And what you want to do is you really want to focus on not blaming or accusing the patient of having anxiety. If you say, hey, well, you're anxious because, they're going to get really defensive. So allow them to process that sometimes silence is totally okay. So if you need to be silent for your patient, just make sure that you use your therapeutic communication in order to help the patient. The other thing that you also want to not do is don't fix the patient. Know that it's not your job to fix the patient, and use what you want to do is you want to focus on relieving the anxiety with tools from like your own toolbox. So like guided imagery or finding resources. So they need, a mental health professional, this is really a good opportunity. And I struggled with this in school and also in practice. I would find these patients that I would realize that they were dealing with some sort of anxiety and they needed some tools and I just didn't have it. And I finally took a step back and I said, look, this is not my lane. And I know other people that can help you. So educate your patients and reach out and provide resources for them if they need it. Today, we really focused on a lot of communication and learning how to help our patients navigate these interpersonal relationships. Remember to also focus on professionalism when you're helping your patients as well through these different nursing concepts. So let's recap. Remember, recognize that defense mechanisms are ways that your patients cope with anxiety. Don't forget that these three things fall on the spectrum of defense mechanisms, so that they're healthy, moderate, or unhealthy. So your unhealthy ways, they can't cope with anxiety. They deflect. Moderate, they're still unhealthy, but they're not destructive. And your healthy ways they may not even seem like defense mechanisms, but know that they are healthy ways of coping with that anxiety. Also, continue to be therapeutic. Dig deeper for your patient. There was a lot of info today for our lesson on defense mechanisms. Thanks for hanging in there. Make sure you check out all the resources attached to this lesson. Now go out and be your best selves today. And as always, happy nursing.